we want people to disseminate the ideas that they have. We really believe that too few people fear sharing their belief systems, and it's great practice. So that's number one, is just like, we need more practice, and we especially being folks that have less proximity to power. There's a lot of data on how important it is for women in higher ed to learn to self-promote. Even though self-promotion, there's a lot of people cringe at that, like, oh no, you've got to be humble and you've got to, like, be polite. But honestly, there's a lot of data that show how self-promotion can really advance someone's status and career. And we do want to see more equitable roles in faculty and leadership positions.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Hello, fellow do-gooders and friends. I'm your host, Corinna Bellizzi. For all of you who've been wondering what more you can do to create a more sustainable, regenerative future in which we can all thrive, I invite you to open yourself, to listen today with an engaged mind, with curiosity, and to ultimately be ready to get your notebook out and take notes as I interview Dr. Alicia Affolter. I venture to guess that we'll all be doing that. Now, Dr. Alicia Afolter is the director of and faculty for Prescott College's Sustainability Education Ph.D. program. Prior to this role, she worked as a senior research scientist and equity consultant at the University of Washington's Center for Evaluation and Research for STEM Equity. She earned her Ph.D. in curriculum and instruction with a focus on multicultural education from the UW, working alongside Dr. Geneva Gay, founder of Culturally Responsive Teaching. Supported by the National Science Foundation, Emily's current focus is to highlight culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies for teachers, faculty, and leaders in K through 16 settings and STEM higher education utilizing an equity literacy frame. Her latest teachings center on decolonizing research, equitable research methodologies, and liberatory organizational change methods. Wow, that has all been a mouthful for me today. Dr. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Corinna. I really appreciate your kind words.
It's amazing to have the opportunity to connect, especially as I'm someone who has always dreamed of one day becoming a PhD. So let's talk for a moment about what has inspired you on your educational journey and what really led you to this moment.
Well, I think a lot of us know intrinsically what we know is true. So often when I was teaching with a bachelor's degree, I was teaching Spanish at a Waldorf school, and I enjoyed it. But I had a lot of questions, and a lot of questions about, is this equitable? Might there be a way to do this differently? Who is being disenfranchised by this curricula? Who is being lifted up by this? And while I was looking for answers, I felt like in my gut I knew, but I needed to investigate that further, to really understand, is my gut telling me what many other people are thinking as well? And if so, how can I share that and sort of build a larger community of thinkers, educators, learners that are having these conversations with similar language? So I really wanted to investigate my gut, I guess.
So as you've continued on your adventures in the field of education, now leading a program at Prescott College, how do you feel like your prior education journey has prepared you for today?
Well, I believe that we all are constantly obtaining knowledge through formal and informal experiences wherever we go. And in the world of education, we call that funds of knowledge, that every individual sort of has this plethora of knowledges. We like to pluralize that because it's complex and it's more than one singular type of knowledge. And so I especially if we have a practice that's reflective, we call that reflexivity, which is we're reflective. And as we reflect, then we're committed to acting differently with respect to what we've learned from our reflections. So if we have a reflexive practice, I believe that everything that we do is going to inform where we are today. the PhD itself, there were so many things I loved about being at a large institution at the University of Washington. I had an incredibly supportive and brilliant advisor. If you haven't heard of her, Dr. Geneva Gay is truly an icon. Like you said, she founded culturally responsive teaching, and her work in the field of multicultural, anti-racist pedagogy is incredibly important and prolific. So she did wonders for me. And I think the most meaningful part of our relationship is that she saw me as a whole person. She didn't see me just as a vessel to be filled with the knowledges that she had, but rather it was a very reciprocal relationship in which we were personally connected. We saw each other in all of our dimensionality, and she was committed to supporting me and guiding me through a very longitudinal, arduous process. And so I bring not just her, but I just want to holler at all of the people, thinkers that I know, friends, family, ancestors that have supported where I am today. And a lot of what I believe is that, we have to think in a collective way. And so I am here today because of all those who came before me that supported this path. And I really try to pay it forward.
I love that concept. When we initially spoke, you talked about how things were just a little different at Prescott and how you were working to, what was a phrase? You said you were rehumanizing a pedagogy of love. I just found that that phrase stood out to me when we were initially conversing. And so I'd love for you to describe it in your own words. I also think that the lay public doesn't necessarily hear the word pedagogy often. So I think it's important that we understand what we're talking about, kind of like just defining the problem and then defining how the solution could be different as well.
Yes. So we think about pedagogy in the educational world as the content and the methods of our teaching practice. So it's sort of like what you teach and how you teach it are your pedagogy. Now, when we talk about rehumanizing pedagogy, we're thinking about how much of our academic and educational systems basically make us feel like we're small silos of ourselves. Like we're trying really hard to amplify really small parts of ourselves while cutting off many other parts. One of the problems is that the factors that we're trying to elevate in terms of like dominant educational norms tend to really advantage folks with more proximity to power. And so you can see those of us that have more proximity to power based on our embodied experience or some of the world that we inherited, we might have an easier time with, your average pedagogy. What we're trying to do at Prescott College is say, it's interesting how many people feel dehumanized, marginalized, invisibilized by this educational endeavor. And how can we make that right? How can we completely change it up? So I'll give you some examples. We talk in our curriculum about windows and mirrors. So we would expect for everyone who's teaching in our program to not only experience mirror reflections of themselves in the curricula, like really to relate to what they're reading about or what they're watching in the curricula, but also to look beyond themselves. Those are the windows, right? And so oftentimes our students of color or our queer, trans students, they're not seeing themselves reflected proportionally in the curricula as students that have more dominant racialized sexuality, ability status, and other identities. And so one of the things we try to do in rehumanizing is really windows and mirrors that are more proportional and leaning towards minoritization, like folks with minoritized identities. We want to amplify those and amplify the way people see themselves with those identities so that they can feel again that they have that dignity and humanity that so many students with more privileged identities just implicitly feel by how dominant curriculum is reflected.
No, I'm just want to interject here for a moment because this is part of what attracted me initially to University of California at Santa Cruz for my undergrad work because at the age in which I went to UCSC, we even had most of our courses would actually provide a written evaluation of your work as opposed to just a grade. And that has since been retired. In fact, I don't even know if they even issue evaluations any longer. There were some cases in which it was very confusing when I had a particularly tough instructor that didn't like to give positive feedback. And so it didn't matter how well you did in the class, your evaluation read like a criticism, right? So there's, I think, the good and the bad of that style of a course leadership. But for the most part, what it enabled a student to do was really identify where their strengths were and where their weaknesses were, and there was more depth to the information that that instructor provided you with. It also forced the school to have smaller class sizes because there was that integrated kind of relationship between you and the teacher. So in today's world within the UC system, I think that has gone the way of the dodo. I will say at the time I was there, I could actually take courses for a grade, and there was some chatter within the university saying that students were having a hard time getting into graduate programs because of the fact that they didn't have a letter grade equivalent GPA the same way that they might need one to get into some of these leading schools. And so it became doubly important for me to achieve honors in the major, which I was able to do. However, may have left some students a little behind the eight ball if they were on an academic track. So I'm really kind of curious to see if your institution, in a way, is working to help people feel less like a number by having some of these similar constructs in place so that there's more feedback, or how it would look different.
100%. I think, first of all, I just want to say I relate to so much of what you're saying. You're constantly toggling when you work in sort of a colonial patriarchal system, like any higher educational system in the United States right now, any that I know of. And so, for example, like you're saying, I mean, I think that there are sort of the values oriented reasons why you would wish to have a narrative evaluation, and then you're contending that with the vocational limitations that someone might be up against. If they don't have grades, are they going to be treated fairly in the hiring process or in the next stage of their academic career? And then we look at compounding minoritization, like if they basically aren't harboring many dominant identities, what is that? How much more of a disadvantage could a narrative evaluation be for them? At the same time, most of the time, qualitative feedback is going to be much more meaningful than quantitative for our students. And so one of the things that and for a long time, Prescott College did narrative assessments as well. And we moved away from it. And I was part of that conversation almost 10 years ago for the very reason of, can you get veterans tuition exemption if you have a narrative evaluation? A lot of the time it's no, in my experience. And, different ways in which it created barriers for students pragmatically. At the same time, I'm glad you brought up assessment, because I think assessment is such an important conversation when we think about pedagogies of love and when we think about culturally responsive pedagogy. And what really the data say in culturally responsive pedagogy is that we need to rethink assessment. So we're leaning so much less on summative assessment, which would be a final project, a test, a quiz, something that is just a singular summation of learning, versus formative assessment, which is the process piece of learning. We have so de-emphasized in higher ed process in learning that unfortunately the system is rigged. These summative assessments tend to advantage some while disadvantaging others, and at the end of the day can really stymie and impede learning. And so in my classes, I've reorganized the grading schema so that the majority of any student grade is what we call formative, which basically means, are you showing up? To what extent are you showing up? Because I'm so much more interested in engagement than I am in some summative piece. And the other reality is, if we bring sort of an equity frame to it, everyone is coming in with a different set of tools, into any situation. And so in a short term, if you say you're grading everyone equally, but they come in and one person has a JD and EDD and written 10 books, and one person's like, I want to learn to write, is it really appropriate to evaluate them in the same way? Like we're about dexterity in our evaluation so we can really support each student's individual progression towards their goals.
I will just say separately too that when people engage, they tend to learn more. So if you're incentivizing the engagement, I think that makes a lot of sense because what they will cumulatively learn and the process of being in the course will be greater if they've remained engaged. If it feels like it's nothing you do will be enough, then I don't think that you're going to get the same impact from that course. You might even just eke by to get the C or equivalent to that, just to check that box and have succeeded in the class, right?
Absolutely. It's like fear-based effort opposed to inquiry-based effort, right? And I think what you're saying too makes me think about self-trust. I believe that our educational systems really compromise our own ability to trust ourselves and to allow for ourselves to measure expectations, to imagine goals, to push ourselves, right? And to actually and I think that there is a false binary all over the place with respect to people who we perceive to know more, experts, and ourselves in different settings. It's very contextual. And so I also think this is an exercise in, at the end of the day, who is this for? And whose opinion really matters. And ultimately, ideally, it would be our own, right?
Awesome. Now, obviously, through this early phase in our discussion, you've demonstrated that you care a lot about unpacking how supremacy culture shows up in our work lives and in our educational lives and in our life lives. So, let's talk about this part of our culture. Where has it gotten us? Where has it gone wrong? And how do you propose that we work to dismantle it to create something new and potentially better?
Yeah, well, I like to think of it as sort of, if you think of systems of oppression or systems of domination as sort of the water in which we swim. And a lot of the work for me is practicing seeing it. In the work that I do, it's also recognizing that stories are part of systems. So any anecdote to me in any experience, I'm panning in my mind to imagine, how is this anecdote reflective of these larger systems of power, right? And so it's, first of all, it's like a lifelong constant process. And we talk about, it's kind of like supremacy systems are so pervasive that they're just always up in our minds and our bodies and ourselves. And we have to work actively and continuously for the long haul forever in order to just continue to recognize them and unlearn them. And I think of it akin to just plaque removal. Like the plaque's going to keep on building because we're bombarded with all of these messages of what is good, what is bad, what is moral, what is amoral, and they're attached to, they're encoded with values that are that minoritize folks and really harm folks. They harm all of us. So yeah, I think colonization is one way of looking at it. Is that you can always pick a frame, you can pick a point of reference to see, what is the historical context for this particular issue. I encourage people to have a critical historical understanding of their field so they can do some work to see, what were the origins of my field, my town. Like, what are the indigenous story of the place that I live? What's the current, the historical and current future oriented, and how can I understand the impacts of colonization relative to that history and future? And so I don't know if there's a singular way to discuss supremacy except that it is pervasive. And so my big question to myself, to anyone with whom I'm working, particularly folks of settler ancestry who are white identifying, which I am, is how might I be in collusion with systems of supremacy without knowing it or meaning to be? And it's not it's not optional. It's like we're in these systems, we exist in them, we're swimming in them. So how do we start to check ourselves? Like, how might I be colluding or complicit with a system that might benefit some and marginalize others? And then what steps can I take, like you said, to dismantle that? And the answers are, infinite, but also they're very contextual. So it's like, if I'm looking at my pedagogy or if I'm looking at my class, I mean, one of the things you were talking about is feedback and evaluation. And with good equity hygiene, one of the things that we want to do, especially when we sort of embody or hold a position of power, is solicit continuous feedback from the folks that are receiving services from us. And not only do we want to solicit continuous feedback that is, you can make it anonymous, the option to anonymize it, but we also want to have an accountability mechanism in place so that if people are giving us feedback, they know that we're accountable to making changes based on that feedback. And so that's a mechanism in my classes. I try to have sort of like weekly feedback opportunities for students. And then, I teach a class on culturally responsive teaching. We had a bunch of work on like white supremacy culture and white privilege. And one of my students of color was like, I don't want to read about white supremacy. Like, I'm done. I want to read, about my BIPOC folks read on, like Black futures or, something like that. And so then I was able to say, thank you. That is what a great point. I'm letting everyone know this is the feedback that came in. And these are all the reading and podcasts that we have added to this week. And anybody who opts can opt into those instead. And so I think maybe one of the ways of unlearning is like sort of humility and this sort of commitment to accountability to make change based on a solicitation of continuous feedback.
Well, frankly, it's hard to take feedback and change courses every session, right? So I think one of the challenges of being in academics, and I noticed this even as I recently went to Santa Clara University for my MBA, I graduated in 2021, so not too long ago, right? And I found that some of the course material was pretty outdated, specifically about things like social media and digital advertising, because those particular areas of expertise, they change so rapidly. I mean, Google Ads themselves has something like 15,000 minor updates over the course of a year. And so it looks different as a platform by the end of one year than it looked at the beginning of that year. And even the functionality of how you would see the data shifts dramatically in that time. So, in the case of my course in social media, just as one example, I had to give feedback to the professor that some of what they were teaching was so outdated that it could get people in trouble if they were trying to implement some of those strategies. And in particular, could get a store on Amazon shut down. So I think it's hard, specifically in academics, because going back and changing the curriculum on a routine basis can be challenging to say just simply. And the course director or that the professor has the freedom to make these kind of minor changes along the way to make it more relevant to the present time, I think is really critical, especially if you're trying to build leaders of tomorrow, because the rate at which we're learning and the rate at which technology is forcing change too is so very rapid. And I just, I applaud the effort. I do also hear criticism on the other side of that saying, well, if you're constantly shifting what the course is actually using as its seed curriculum, how are you keeping it in some quantifiable measure? Is it still going to be as, let's say, hefty in the content or as deep? And I wonder if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we have our learning outcomes and we have our course description, and you have to go through a pretty rigorous revision process if you're going to change those. Within that container, however, I do think that the approach, the methods can really and must be nimble and responsive to the needs, the purposes, the goals of the people in the room. So you have your learning objectives, right? Like I have folks create what we call a pedagogical model, which is like a visual model, like a theory of change, basically, of how they would in their sector, because it's actually a transdisciplinary approach, they would apply culturally responsive teaching in their sector. But the way that you would go about that, I mean, there are so many ways, right? And I think theory that you're using, I love to have a menu of readings. I love to have, 6 readings and, 3 podcasts and 2 TED Talks and give people space, like to self-select. All of these readings could help you achieve this learning objective. But what I want is it to be relevant to the folks in the room. And if it's not, what am I doing? Like, and I think of that for any of us as educators. In our program, we ask our students, who are just phenomenal, we ask them, why are you here? What are your goals? What's your purpose? And how can we support you in achieving that purpose. But we don't want to deviate or distract from this sort of intrinsic knowing that they come in with. So we do try to honor that. But you're right. There are some parameters that we have to be honoring.
Yeah. I think of my earlier college days because my undergrad, I graduated in 98 as a Santa Cruz slug, right? Anthropology, honors in the major, focused on archaeology and primatology, evolution, things along those lines, right? And I gotta tell you, the readers, which were just full of articles that you had to get printed and bound at the Bay Tree bookstore and things along those lines was extensive. And in graduate school at Santa Clara, it was really the same, but more of these came through electronically. So I could just read the PDF and print it at home or something along those lines. Now, I understand that in leading this particular set of courses and the PhD program in sustainability education, that you've got a little bit of liberty to shift how things are really done. What do you think you're doing really right? And what could we learn from that, even from the outside?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of hubris in academia. So when I think about those, I remember those readers, right?
What have you
Those
published
readers,
lately? You know?
yeah, it's like, for who is this reader? So I think one of the things so I have a really phenomenal team of faculty, and we work in a highly collaborative fashion. Right now, we're working on a book project together that is looking at how higher education can be really harmful for a lot of folks. We're serving many people who are either in PhD programs or who have graduated with PhDs to understand what didn't work for you and what might have been dehumanizing in the process and what did work for you. What are your hacks? And so we're actively collecting data on it. But maybe what we want to do is create an offering, and we are doing it. We have a publisher, but an offering that helps people understand based on so much lived experience of what's not working, which is this feeling like you're a number, this feeling like you have no authorship in the trajectory of your research, this feeling like there is one way of demonstrating success, this feeling like you're not a writer. All these things, these barriers people experience in the form of imposter syndrome, and just melt them away. So some of the things I think we're doing is actively researching this topic and having conversations with people so we can think together about antidotes, building all of our curricula in ways that are at the center, honoring the unique purpose of the students that come in. So we're more interested in, like, Corinna, if you were a student, who are you and what is it that you wish to achieve? And how can we take this space to refine and deepen that through these theoretical or practical lenses? So I think we're very student-centric and we're relational. We really care. You talked about course ratios, but we really care about our individual students and we want them to have continuous feedback as well. And we're not going to quantify our students as little as we can quantify our students as possible, because we're here to sort of go shoulder to shoulder with them and basically cheer them on and give them any tools or resources that we or anyone we know have that would amplify their purpose, but we respect their purpose because it aligns with our values of social and environmental justice. So we all believe that social and environmental justice are the sort of key values to a regenerative future. And we believe that we're peers in this work. So I do think some of it is just how you approach the work, and then the rest is the alchemy and magic of who's in the program. And don't even get me started because our students are just absolutely phenomenal.
So I want to speak for a moment because you brought up a couple things so far in our conversation that I think that we should connect on and kind of deepen. One of them is specifically about how closely connected you are to power class or to the power. Another of which is imposter syndrome. And I feel like these two ideas are very much connected, but I've also been a little tired of how much I see people saying, you can't or shouldn't ever feel like an imposter. Just go out there and do it and then learn by doing. And somehow you can even say you're an expert, but you're really not yet. Like there's some limitations here. Like And I think that this comes through so much in the world of coaching when, somebody goes through a course and becomes a coach and they might be 22 years old and lack a lot of lived experience and not really have intrinsically experienced some of the learnings that they're putting out into the world. And yet someone's standing by them, cheerleading them and saying, just say no to imposter syndrome. You can do it. There's something to that lived experience. And I think you gain power through that experience. So I'm just curious to see how you see these things fitting together while also not telling us to be quiet, while also not telling us that we can't speak truth to power, because I think there is incredible value in being willing to speak up. So I think I've kind of given you a framework of what I'm thinking about, and I just love your thoughts.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I love your question. Yeah. So I think contextuality is something maybe important that the median age of our students in the program is 47. They come in with a minimum of one graduate degree, oftentimes more. So we want people to disseminate the ideas that they have. We really believe that too few people fear sharing their belief systems, and it's great practice. So that's number one, is just like we need more practice, and we especially being folks that have less proximity to power. There's a lot of data on how important it is for women in higher ed to learn to self promote. Even though self promotion, there's a lot of people cringe at that, like, oh no, you've got to be humble and you've got to, like be polite. But honestly, there's a lot of data that show how self promotion can really advance someone's status and career. And we do want to see more equitable roles in faculty and leaderships, right? And so that's one thing. Is just imposter syndrome is similar. Imposter syndrome is something that folks with more minoritized identities, like folks of color, women, queer and trans folks, would experience to a higher degree. So I just want to say how important it is that we know that that's not anecdotal. So if we know that folks with more minoritized identities experience imposter syndrome more, what is the way that we can help challenge that problematic pattern, right? That keeps some voices at the fore and others quiet. And so I think imposter syndrome is a symptom of a supremacy culture. So it's not like, oh, I have imposter syndrome. It's like I'm experiencing a symptom of something that's going to hit me in certain ways. So I think just to your point, of course, we also have high academic expectations, and we really want to cultivate and refine the skills of communication and deep and thorough inquiry. But we also keep perfectionism is something that can really impede one's ability to ever allow themselves to express themselves publicly. And we want to question if perfectionism is even something that anyone would wish to uphold as something that can harm many.
Great. No, I can't say I disagree with any of that. I ultimately think that perfectionism I consider it one of my faults. Let's put it that way. I think perfectionism is the enemy of having fun. And if you want to stay in a creative space, that it needs to be a little bit fun. And if you're constantly thinking about what needs to be perfect, then you don't come up with the same creative solutions to the challenges that you're faced with. So it's something that I personally have to battle in my day to day to say, okay, is this good enough? Now, if I threw it at the wall, what do I think about it now? Right? If I turned it on its head, this is why I love some of the creative thinking and coursework that I had specifically in entrepreneurship at Santa Clara University. And I didn't expect the entrepreneurship classes to be quite as interesting as they were. They were more like thought experiments. And then they were like sitting down and reading books about entrepreneurs. It was like, okay, so what would it take to create the worst restaurant? And so you create this really kind of fun story about the worst restaurant, and it helps you identify what things really matter if you're going to create the best restaurant experience, because you're essentially erasing all these things that probably irked you at some point in your lived experience about dining out, right? And so that one was really fun. Another was, to do exercises like brushing your teeth that day with your opposite hand, or, even tying your dominant hand behind your back for an hour and trying to just do all of your chores around the house that way to get you thinking about what it would be like to be differently abled and how you would be forced to use your creativity and just another part of your body and your mind in order to get through a particular thing. Did I expect to learn this kind of stuff in business school? Not at all. Did we come up with some really interesting ideas? Yes. And it was fun, right?
Yes, I love. Well, you're making me think of like how many times, have I been in therapy where I think there's a single answer to a question. And then my therapist will be like, you're standing in the bottom of a hole and you perceive there's no back, but you just have to turn around. You're like looking at the wall, thinking it's, enveloping you, and you just turn around. But I think that's exactly it. One of the things that we try to do in all ways in this curriculum is recognize that binary thinking, like that there is a right or a wrong answer, that this is again like summative assessment, like we talked about, is never enough, right? Like binary thinking is going to reinforce very simple ideals that perpetuate norms that we want to question. And so, how can we begin to look at every question that we have that's in a binary format and reimagine it to make it plural and conditional? Like instead of even as simple as what is your podcast about, Corinna? Like something very simple, and you would feel like you had to think of a singular response to that. You could say, what might some of the characteristics of your podcast be? And just that simple tweak in the way we ask the question allows you to have infinite answers. And I think one of the things that we struggle with as a society, because we're so conditioned to think and behave as if binaries existed and there were no other options, is that we stop thinking critically and we stop thinking creatively. And I think that's one of the biggest unlearnings for myself, is constantly reimagining. If I believe that there's a singular answer to this, I got to start again.
Well, this ties to a recent episode where I interviewed somebody about AI, right? Artificial intelligence. One of the reasons that it kind of remains in this genius state is its continual childlike curiosity of learning more. And then the fact that we encourage it in a way, even to have hallucinations, come up with ideas that don't make sense. When it comes together, sometimes it's throwing stuff at a wall and then coming up with solutions that we might not have otherwise thought about. And that can be part of what gets us out of some of our even extractive principles of how we run society. So, I think that even as we look at something like artificial intelligence and the threats and the promise that it provides us with, we even need to think about that with a curious mind as opposed to one of kind of judgment and closed thinking, because that's exactly, I think, what keeps us with the status quo. And frankly, it's exactly what millennials and zennials are pissed off about. Like, they are upset with Gen X now as much as our generation was upset with boomers, because as people age, they tend to get more closed in their thinking. And suddenly it becomes like, oh, well, I'm entering my later years in the workforce. Now I'm going to be protective of what I have and my fence line, and not think about being a part of the whole anymore, because my mind, in a way, is allowing itself to shrink as opposed to expanding and integrating with the outer world. Now, when you tell me your average age student in your school is 47, that's kind of amazing. It was a lot higher than what I expected you would say. I also really just want to understand what somebody could expect from this education experience. If they are even like, I'm 47, I'll be 48 in September. You know, if I was to join in a PhD program in sustainability education, really, what does that mean? And how is this learning, this doctoral program, really going to benefit me, let's say, as an individual, if I seek to go this route, and then how I would apply it after the fact. If I can get that, maybe selfishly, I'll ask you that question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, we ask that to each of our individual students. So we ask them, why are you here? And what might being here do to support your career? So I'm going to give you some broad examples of the kinds of students that we have. Some of the folks that we just graduated, one is a high sort of sustainability board consultant at the global level. One of them is a dean of a small college. One of them is a high school educator. One of them is an indigenous elder from the African continent. Like, we have all these different folks doing different kinds of work. What they're going to leave with is going to be really somewhat different because their goals are different. But I'll say this, we help. So much of it is like, what is it that you want from this experience, and how can we create a vessel for you to deepen and amplify a thing that you wish to know more about? The other thing that we do is there's a real currency to a PhD, and with that is a whole language. So we do a significant amount of writing and research training and multiple methodologies, anti-colonial methodologies, critical theory, quantitative, qualitative, indigenous statistics. Like, we're doing a whole range of things. What people leave with is a toolkit that allows them to speak much more deeply with really strong conceptual lenses that can be applied to practice, to action anywhere. One of the things that we have folks do often is participatory action research, so that they can use something they want to do. Like, people, I want to launch a business, or I want to create a consulting curriculum. We say, that's great. Create the curriculum, base it on theory that you really are interested in, and then pilot it. And as you pilot it, you can measure the efficacy of it. And as you measure the efficacy of it, you write about implications for change. And then all of a sudden, you're graduating with a PhD and, a new business or a new curricula that you wish to consult with. And it's been tested. And so a lot of it is helping people formalize professional pathways that they're already on. And we encourage our students to publish. I'm so proud to see how many of our students are publishing on a monthly basis. One of the students that graduated from our program, one of my advisees last year, had 50 million views on one of her articles before graduating. And it was integral to her dissertation work. And so some of it is just practice on strategies for socially engaged public scholarship too. And then the last thing that I think is so amazing that we're not talking enough about is how impactful it can be to get sort of these global change makers who all care about similar values in the same room and just watch sort of the incredible equation of them building something together. The amount of collaborations, like partnerships, consulting gigs, like publications, supporting each other in grant work. I mean, we are seeing so much peer enrichment that I couldn't even begin to count, the number of these that come out of it. But that's just an unanticipated impact of having people who care about the same thing in a room who are excited to build.
Is there any program like yours that you're aware of?
No, there are some sustainability related PhDs in the UK, but their system is, as I understand it, much more sort of decentralized and sort of like one-to-one. You just come in and you journey on with your dissertation, and you know what you want when you come in. And for us, we actually practice emergent strategy. Just shout out to Adrienne Marie Brown. The notion of how emergence is important to the process, that we don't expect people to have a research question that's firm when they come in. We hope that it unfurls and that we can all tend that unfurling together.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that it sounds like, when I've experienced even an undergrad, when you say, okay, well, I'm coming into a university, I don't have an exact major that fits what the curriculum the school is offering. So I'm going to work with the head of this department and create something of an independent study program to create the degree. And so when you describe what you're doing, it feels like it's part of that, but that you're putting a framework around it. So it becomes a PhD in sustainability education, but really catered to the individual journey of the person and their skills as they're coming in. Would that be the quickest way to sum it up?
Absolutely. Like, we oriented some new students this week. One of them is a paleoclimatologist. One of them is a classical musician. One of them is an artist with an MFA in change making. One of them is a cyber big data analyst. And it's so cool because you get together with folks. Oh, one of them is a sustainability professional in higher ed. So you get all these folks together and you seemingly, like really divergent paths. But the great thing is that there's a simple glue. So they are doing their own divergent thing in a way because we honor their purpose and their research question and their domain. But at the same time, there's so much that can be learned from working in a cross-disciplinary space like that. And that's some of the most exciting work I get to.
Awesome. Well, I feel like I could talk to you all day. I'd love to invite you back to have a future conversation and dig in a little bit more deeply. I have many more questions I could ask you, but I'd like to offer my guests the opportunity to sum up with a closing thought, or if there was a question I hadn't asked that you wish I had, you could ask and answer that.
I think my closing thought is just I wish for everyone to be able to find that part of themselves, almost that childlike part of themselves that is so inquiry based, like almost play learning based, that we can still tap into in order to allow those curiosities to like bubble up to the surface. And so many of us have, out of fear, out of hustle culture, out of just acculturation and supremacy cultures, have sort of de-emphasized curiosity. And so I just hope for that we can remember how important that is and how that is what's going to rehumanize our landscape and make for a more sustainable and regenerative future.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I've loved having you as a guest.
Thank you. I love talking to you. You're such an inquisitive person, and it's a treat to get to know you and be here.
Yeah, just call me curious.
Curious Corinna. I love it.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me. To find out more about Dr. Alicia Affolter and her work with Prescott College, visit the links that we provide with show notes. You'll find a link to our expanded blog page, on which you will also see the video version of this podcast, including transcripts. We are launching our new Cause Before Commerce site this summer. It's called simply circleb.co. This site will host the same content that you find today on caremorebebetter.com, while also providing helpful tools to help you live a little greener, a little more regeneratively, a little more socially and locally engaged. You'll find how-to guides and DIY tools that can help you renew what you have, replace things you buy, and reduce waste. When it fully launches this summer, it will also offer plastic-free products from housewares and clothing to health-promoting supplements and personal care items, all of which are circular in design, that minimize waste, and that seek to limit our reliance on plastics. You can explore our landing page now to learn more about this upcoming launch. Just visit circleb.co. Thank you, listeners and watchers, now and always, for being a part of this pod and this community, because together we really can do so much more. We can care more, we can be better, we can build a society that respects all people and their unique contributions while we preserve this planet. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.